Millionaire pretended to be a simple gardener and met his fiancée's parents. See how he was treated. Richard Anderson gazed at New York City from his 40th floor office. The glittering lights of the metropolis reflected in his tired eyes, creating an ironic contrast with the emptiness he felt inside. At 35, the young entrepreneur had achieved more than most people dreamed of in a lifetime. His tech company, Anderson Tech, was a leader in the American market and rapidly expanding globally. However, while his bank account overflowed, his heart withered. Richard let out a heavy sigh, his fingers drumming idly on the polished mahogany desk. The lonely echo of this gesture seemed to mock him in the silence of the empty office. "Another day, another few million," he muttered to himself, a bitter smile forming on his lips. It was a private joke, but there was no humor in his voice. His cell phone vibrated, the screen lighting up with a flurry of notifications, messages from friends asking about the next party, women he barely knew, hinting at encounters, and of course, the inevitable requests for financial favors. Richard ignored them all, tossing the device aside with a gesture of disgust. Rising abruptly, he walked to the panoramic window. His reflection stared back at him, carefully combed dark hair, impeccable Italian suit, shoes that cost more than many of his employees' monthly salaries. But it was his eyes that caught attention, eyes that carried the weight of a loneliness that no amount of money seemed capable of alleviating. "Who are you really, Richard Anderson?" he asked himself quietly, his hand touching the cold glass. The question echoed in his mind, unanswered. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah, his personal assistant, entered, hesitantly. "Mr. Anderson, sorry to bother you so late, but you asked me to remind you about tonight's charity dinner." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, suppressing a groan. Another event where he'd have to smile, shake hands, and make empty promises to people who only cared about his money and influence. "Thank you, Sarah. You can go home now. I'll manage from here." The young woman nodded, casting a concerned look at her boss before leaving. She was the only person in the company who seemed to see beyond Richard's facade of success. Perceiving the loneliness that consumed him, alone again, Richard loosened his tie, feeling suffocated, not just by the accessory, but by the entire life he had built. Every achievement, every acquisition, every flattering headline in business newspapers, it all seemed empty now. He grabbed his jacket and left the office, ignoring the curious glances from the few employees still working late. In the elevator, Richard made an impulsive decision. Instead of going to the charity dinner, he directed his driver to a quiet residential neighborhood in Brooklyn. When the car stopped, Richard got out and dismissed the driver, promising to call a taxi later. Alone on the sidewalk, he observed the simple houses around him, lit windows revealing glimpses of normal lives, families dining together, couples watching TV, children playing. That's when he saw her, a young woman walking down the street, carrying shopping bags and a stack of books. She stumbled, almost dropping everything. Without thinking, Richard ran to help her. "Let me help," he said, picking up some books that had fallen. The woman looked at him, surprised, and then smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile, unlike anything Richard had seen in a long time. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and melodious. "I'm Beth." "Richard," he replied, momentarily forgetting all his titles and achievements. At that instant, he was just a man helping a woman on the street. As they walked side by side, chatting casually, Richard felt something awaken inside him, a forgotten sensation of connection, of possibility. Looking at Beth, with her brown hair tied in a messy bun and slightly crooked glasses, he saw something his money could never buy: authenticity. That night, while New York's elite gathered in a luxurious hall for a charity dinner, Richard Anderson discovered that the true treasure he was seeking might be hidden in the simple streets of an ordinary neighborhood, in the sincere smile of a stranger. Little did he know that this casual encounter was about to turn his life upside down, challenging everything he thought he knew about love, value, and the true richness of life. In the days that followed the casual encounter with Beth, Richard found himself consumed by thoughts of the young teacher. Her genuine smile and warm gaze had left an indelible mark on his memory, contrasting drastically with the superficial interactions he was accustomed to. Sitting in his office, Richard could barely concentrate on the financial reports in front of him. His eyes constantly wandered to the window, as if expecting to see Beth walking down there among the skyscrapers. "Mr. Anderson?" Sarah's voice brought him back to reality. "The board is waiting for you in the meeting room." Richard nodded distractedly, adjusting his tie as he stood up. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be there in a minute." As he walked through the mirrored corridors of Anderson Tech, Richard couldn't help but notice the admiring and fearful glances from his employees. It was a constant reminder of the chasm that existed between him and the rest of the world, a chasm that for the first time in years he desperately wished to cross. The board meeting was a blur of charts, projections, and expansion strategies. Richard participated mechanically, his mind wandering to the quiet neighborhood where he had met Beth. When the meeting finally ended, he made an impulsive decision. "Sarah," he called his assistant as soon as he left the room, "cancel my appointments for the rest of the week. Tell everyone I'm on an urgent business trip." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded. "Yes, sir. Any specific destination I should mention?" Richard paused, a small smile forming on his lips. "Let's say I'm in search of alternative investments." That night in his penthouse apartment, Richard stared at his wardrobe full of expensive suits and Italian shoes. With determination, he headed to a small closet in the back, where he kept some more casual clothes that he rarely wore. Wearing simple jeans, a polo shirt, and sneakers, Richard barely recognized himself in the mirror. His fingers ran through his hair, messing up the perfectly styled cut. Finally, he put on a pair of thick-framed glasses, an accessory he normally used only for reading. "John," he murmured to his reflection, testing the name he had chosen for his new persona, John the gardener. The transformation wasn't just physical. As he looked at himself in the mirror, Richard felt the weight of his responsibilities, expectations, and the loneliness that haunted him dissipate, even if momentarily. In its place came a sense of freedom and possibility that he hadn't experienced since his youth. The next morning, Richard, now John, arrived in the neighborhood where he had met Beth. His heart raced as he walked down the tree-lined streets, carrying a newly acquired gardening toolbox. It didn't take long for him to spot her. Leaving the house with a stack of books in her arms, Beth looked even more beautiful in the daylight, her face lit up by a smile as she greeted the neighbors. Gathering courage, Richard approached. "Good morning," he said, his voice slightly trembling. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for work as a gardener. Would you need any services?" Beth looked at him curiously, a flash of recognition passing through her eyes. "Hello, I remember you. We met the other day, didn't we? You helped me with the books." Richard's heart leaped. She remembered him. "Ah, yes," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. "What a coincidence to meet again." Beth smiled, the same warm smile that had captured Richard's attention days ago. "Well, actually, our garden does need some care. Why don't you talk to my mum? She's inside." Before Richard could respond, the door of the house opened and a middle-aged lady came out, looking at him suspiciously. "Who is this, Beth?" "Mum, this is Sorry. I didn't catch your name." "John," Richard replied quickly. "Nice to meet you, ma'am." Beth's mother examined him from head to toe, her expression a mixture of skepticism and disdain. "And what do you want?" Richard swallowed hard, feeling strangely vulnerable under the woman's critical gaze. It was a new sensation for him, accustomed to being treated with deference and respect everywhere he went. "I'm offering my services as a gardener," he explained, raising his toolbox as proof. "If you need help with the garden, I'd be happy to work for a fair price." The woman snorted, clearly unimpressed. "And what do you know about gardening, boy? Our garden needs special care." Richard felt panic growing. He knew absolutely nothing about gardening, beyond the basics he had researched the night before. But the prospect of being close to Beth, of truly getting to know her, was too strong to give up now. I learn quickly, ma'am, he stammered, and I promise to work hard. If you give me a chance, I guarantee you won't regret it, Beth intervened, much to Richard's relief. Oh, come on, ma'am, give him a chance. Look at how our garden is, any help would be welcome. Beth's mother hesitated, looking from Richard to her daughter. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she nodded. All right, you can start today, but be warned. If you don't do a good job, you're out. Understood? Richard nodded, enthusiastically, barely able to contain his smile. Yes, ma'am, thank you very much for the opportunity. I promise you won't regret it. As he followed Beth's mother to the back of the house, Richard cast one last look at the young teacher. She smiled at him, her eyes shining with sympathy, and something else, something that made Richard's heart leap again. At that moment, watching Beth walk away to work, Richard knew he had embarked on a journey of no return, a journey that would lead him to discover not only true love but also himself. Little did he know that this impulsive decision to disguise himself as a gardener would trigger a series of events that would test not only his heart, but also his integrity, courage, and everything. He thought he knew about himself and the world around him. The midday sun beat down on Richard's back as he hunched over a rose bed, his unaccustomed hands struggling with a pair of pruning shears. Beads of sweat ran down his face, fogging up the glasses that were now part of his disguise. After a week as John the gardener, his once soft hands were full of calluses and scratches. John. The harsh voice of Mrs. Thompson, Beth's mother, made him straighten up quickly. Those roses need to be perfect for Saturday's charity tea. If you can't handle it, I might as well hire someone more qualified. Richard swallowed hard, nodding respectfully. Yes, ma'am, I'll do my best. As Mrs. Thompson walked away, muttering something about incompetence, Richard couldn't help but reflect on the irony of his situation. Just a few weeks ago, he was the one giving orders, intimidating others with his presence. Now he was on the other side, feeling the weight of judgment and disdain firsthand. However, every time Beth appeared in the garden, with her warm smile and kind words, Richard felt that all the effort was worth it. John. Her voice was like music to his ears. Beth approached, carrying a tray with lemonade. I thought you might be thirsty. It's terribly hot today. Richard smiled, grateful for the kindness. Thank you, Beth. You're very thoughtful. As they drank lemonade together, sitting in the shade of an old mango tree, Richard felt his heart expand. Conversations with Beth were different from anything he had ever experienced. She spoke passionately about her students, about her dreams of improving public education, about the small moments of joy in her everyday life. You know, John, Beth said, her eyes shining, sometimes I think people like you are the real heroes of everyday life, working hard with your own hands to make the world a little more beautiful. Richard felt a pang of guilt, if she knew the truth, but at the same time her words touched him deeply. For the first time in his life he felt valued, not for his money or power, but simply for his effort and presence. Days turned into weeks, and Richard found himself increasingly involved in the Thompson family's life. He met Beth's father, Mr. Thompson, a quiet man who spent hours in his carpentry workshop at the back of the house. There was also Beth's younger brother, Luke, a restless young man who dreamed of becoming a successful businessman. But not everything was rosy in the Thompson garden. Richard soon noticed the underlying tensions in the family. Mrs. Thompson with her social ambitions and obsession with appearances, Mr. Thompson always quiet, carrying an air of resignation, Luke, constantly comparing himself to the rich and successful, his bitterness growing every day. And in the midst of all this, Beth, like a ray of sunshine trying to break through heavy clouds one afternoon, as Richard pruned the bushes near the living room window, he couldn't help but overhear a heated discussion between Beth and her mother. But Mom, I don't want to go to this dinner. You know how uncomfortable I feel at these events full of rich people showing off. Beth's voice sounded exasperated. Beth, my daughter, you need to think about your future. Who knows, you might meet a good match there. Someone who can give you and our family the life we deserve, Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice a mixture of plea and irritation. I don't need a good match, Mum. I'm happy with my life as it is. My work satisfies me and satisfies, Mrs. Thompson interrupted, satisfies paying bills at the limit every month, satisfies seeing your childhood friends in huge houses while you still live in your childhood bedroom. You need to be more ambitious, Beth. Richard felt his heart tighten. The discussion continued, but he moved away, not wanting to invade the family's privacy further. However, the words he heard kept echoing in his mind. That night, lying in his luxurious apartment that now seemed cold and empty, Richard found himself in an internal conflict. On one hand, he had the power to solve all the Thompson family's financial problems with a simple gesture. On the other, revealing his true identity now could destroy the genuine connection he had formed with Beth. Moreover, an uncomfortable question kept arising in his mind. Would Beth accept him if she knew who he really was? Or would she see him only as the good match her mother so desired? The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Richard. During the day, he continued his role as John, the simple and hard-working gardener, deepening his connection with Beth and observing the complex dynamics of the Thompson family. At night, he returned to his life as Richard Anderson, the tech magnate, remotely dealing with the demands of his company and the growing chatter about his mysterious retreat. It was during one of these nights, as Richard contemplated the city from his penthouse, that his phone rang. It was Sarah, his assistant. Mr. Anderson, sorry to bother you so late, but we have a situation. The press is speculating about your whereabouts, and some investors are getting nervous. They're demanding a statement from you or a public appearance. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his two lives colliding. Thank you, Sarah, I'll deal with this tomorrow. Hanging up the phone, he knew he was coming to a decision point. How much longer could he maintain this charade? And, more importantly, what did he really want in the end? Looking at the glittering city below, Richard thought of Beth, of her sincere smile, of her passion for education, of her kindness. He thought of the Thompson family, with all their flaws and conflicts, but also with a sense of unity that his own life never had. At that moment, Richard made a decision. He didn't know exactly how, but he would find a way to unite his two lives, to be truthful with Beth and with himself, to use his privilege and resources to make a difference, not just for one family but for many. But first, he needed to face the truth, and that meant revealing his secret to Beth. With a heavy heart, but determined, Richard prepared for sleep, knowing that the next day would bring challenges that would test not only his love for Beth, but also his own integrity and courage. As the sun rose over New York, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Richard, or John as he was known by the Thompson family, headed once again to the garden that had become his refuge and torment. Today, however, each step seemed heavier, each breath more difficult. For today was the day he planned to reveal the truth to Beth. What he didn't know was that fate had other plans, and that the roots of his disguise were about to become entangled with thorns he could never have foreseen. The dawn brought with it a soft mist that hovered over the Thompsons' garden, as if nature itself was trying to conceal the secrets that were about to come to light. Richard, still in his role as John the gardener, arrived earlier than usual, his heart heavy with the decision to reveal his true identity. To Beth, copy retry Claude's response was limited, as it hit the maximum length allowed at this time. G continuar. Edit continuing the translation. As he busied himself with morning tasks, Richard mentally rehearsed the words he would say. How would he explain his deception? How could he make Beth understand that, despite the initial lie, his feelings were genuine? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. It was Luke, Beth's brother, sneaking out of the house with a backpack. The young man cast a nervous glance around before disappearing down the street. Richard frowned, intrigued by Luke's suspicious behavior, but soon turned his attention back to the task at hand. Today was the day of truth, and nothing could distract him from this purpose. Hours passed, and Richard anxiously awaited Beth's appearance. Finally, around noon, she came out of the house, her face lighting up when she saw him. "John, good to see you," she smiled, approaching. "Mom's busy with preparations for tomorrow's charity tea. I thought you might want a lunch break." Richard felt his heart race. It was now or never. "Beth," he began, his voice trembling, "actually, there's something important I need to tell you." But before he could continue, they were interrupted by screams from inside the house. It was Mrs. Thompson, her voice shrill with panic. "Henry! Beth! Someone call the police!" Beth ran inside with Richard close behind. They found Mrs. Thompson in Mr. Thompson's office, her face pale with shock. "The safe," she stammered, pointing to a small open safe in the wall. "All our savings, Luke's college money, it's all gone." Chaos ensued in the Thompson house. The police were called, questions were asked, suspicions were cast. Amidst the confusion, Richard couldn't help but notice the anguished look Beth repeatedly cast toward the street, as if expecting someone's return. When the dust settled and the police left, promising to investigate, the family gathered in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. "It must have been that new gardener," Mrs. Thompson suddenly declared, casting an accusing look at Richard. "He's been hanging around here observing everything. He probably discovered where we kept the money." Richard felt his blood run cold. "Ma'am, I swear I had nothing to do with this," he protested. But his words seemed hollow in the face of the family's distrust. It was then that Beth intervened, her voice trembling but determined. "It wasn't John, Mum. I think I know who did this." All eyes turned to her. With tears in her eyes, Beth continued, "Luke has been acting strangely in recent weeks, talking about big plans, about finally hitting the jackpot. I saw him leaving early this morning, with a backpack." The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Mr. Thompson sank into his armchair, face in his hands, while Mrs. Thompson alternated between vehemently denying and lamenting what she had done wrong in raising her son Richard, momentarily forgotten amid the family drama, observed the scene with a mixture of compassion and guilt. He could easily replace the stolen money, solve all this family's financial problems with a single phone call, but in doing so, he would have to reveal his true identity, possibly losing Beth's trust forever. As the Thompson family digested the shocking revelation, the phone rang, breaking the tense silence. Mr. Thompson answered, his voice hoarse with emotion. After a few moments of quiet conversation, he hung up, his face a mask of concern. "It was the police," he announced. They found Luke." A collective sigh ran through the room. Beth stood up, hopeful. "And is he okay? Did he confess?" Mr. Thompson slowly shook his head. "It's not that simple. It seems Luke got involved with dangerous people. He was caught trying to place a big bet in an underground casino. The money he stole from us was confiscated, but what, Dad?" Beth insisted, her voice trembling. "But Luke owes much more than that to these people. They're threatening to hurt him if they don't receive payment within 24 hours. The shock of the news fell like a heavy mantle over everyone in the room. Mrs. Thompson began to sob uncontrollably, while Beth hugged her father, seeking and offering comfort. At the same time, Richard remained still, his mind working furiously. He had the means to resolve this situation, to save Luke and alleviate the Thompson family's suffering. But in doing so, he would have to reveal his true identity, possibly destroying any chance of a future with Beth. It was at this moment of tension that fate decided to throw another twist. The doorbell rang, causing everyone to freeze. Mr. Thompson went to answer, his posture defeated. When the door opened, Richard felt his heart stop. There, standing on the threshold, was Michael, his CFO at Anderson Tech. "Sorry to bother you," Michael began, not noticing Richard in the back of the room. "But I'm looking for Richard Anderson. We have information that he was seen in this neighborhood recently, and it's urgent that we find him. There are critical decisions that need to be made at the company, and—" Michael stopped abruptly, his eyes finally landing on Richard. The silence that followed was deafening. Beth looked from Michael to Richard, confusion clear on her face. "John, what's going on? Who is Richard? Anderson?" Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his lies and decisions falling upon him. When he opened them again, he saw all eyes fixed on him, waiting for an explanation. With a deep sigh, Richard stepped forward. "I am Richard Anderson," he confessed, his voice low but firm, And I think I owe you all an explanation." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of a siren, as if the world outside was echoing the chaos that now reigned inside the Thompson house. Richard's revelations were about to change the course of many lives, and not even he could predict the consequences that would unfold from this moment. The silence that followed Richard's revelation was palpable, heavy as lead in the air of the Thompsons' small living room. The looks ranged from shock to confusion, culminating in Beth's hurt and betrayed gaze. Richard Anderson, Mrs. Thompson was the first to break the silence, her voice oscillating between disbelief and sudden interest. "The tech billionaire?" Richard nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Beth's. "Yes, it's me, and I believe I owe you all an explanation." "An explanation?" Beth finally found her voice, each word laden with hurt. "You lied to me all this time." "Beth, please let me explain," Richard pleaded, taking a step toward her, but she backed away. "Not now," she said firmly, tears glistening in her eyes. "We have more urgent problems to solve, Luke, remember?" The mention of Luke's name brought everyone back to the reality of the situation. Mr. Thompson, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Richard or John or whoever you are, I don't know why you did what you did, but now is not the time for that. My son is in danger, and we don't have the means to help him." Richard felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. He had the means to resolve this situation, to fix what was broken, but at what cost? "I can help," he said finally. "I have the resource. Look, this situation, but I need you to trust me, at least for now." Mrs. Thompson, who until moments ago was accusing him of theft, now looked at him with a mixture of hope and calculation. "You would do that? Help our family?" Richard nodded. "Yes, but not for money or gratitude. I'm doing this because of all of you." His gaze met Beth's again, silently pleading for understanding. She looked away, but not before Richard saw the confusion and conflict in her eyes. Their lowing hours were a whirlwind of activity. Richard made calls, mobilized resources, and with the help of his team, located the underground casino where Lou was being held. The operation to rescue him was quick and discreet, involving strategic payments and some veiled threats to the criminals. When Luke was finally brought home, pale and shaking but unharmed, the Thompson family exploded in a mixture of relief and anger. Mrs. Thompson alternated between hugging her son and reprimanding him for his thoughtless actions. Mr. Thompson just sat silently, the weight of the day's events clearly visible in his slumped shoulders. Beth, in turn, remained distant, observing everything with tired and hurt eyes. Richard desperately wanted to talk to her, to explain himself, but he knew now was not the time. As the night progressed and emotions calmed, Richard prepared to leave. He had done what he could for now, and felt that his presence was now more of an intrusion than a comfort. It was when he was about to walk out the door that Beth finally addressed him. "Why?" she asked simply, her voice low but firm. Richard stopped, turning to face her. "Because I was tired of being seen only as Richard Anderson, the billionaire. Because when I met you that day, I saw something genuine, something real. And I wanted to experience that, even if just for a moment." Beth shook her head, silent tears running down her cheeks. "You don't understand, do you? It wasn't about who you were or how much money you had. It was about honesty, about trust. And you broke that." Her words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He opened his mouth to respond, to defend himself, but realized there was no defense for his actions. No matter how noble his intentions were, he had lied. He had betrayed Beth's trust and that of her family. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice laden with regret. "It was never my intention to hurt you or your family. I fell in love, Beth, with who you are, with what you represent, and I was afraid of losing that if you knew who I really was." Beth stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching for something in his. Finally, she spoke. "I need time, Richard, to process all of this, to understand who you really are and what all this means." Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of pain and hope. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't a complete rejection either. "I understand," he replied softly. "And I'll be here when and if you want to talk. No masks this time, just me." With one last look at Beth and a respectful nod to the rest of the Thompson family, Richard walked out into the night, leaving behind a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions. As he walked down the quiet street, Richard reflected on the day's events. He had saved Luke, yes, but at what cost? Beth's trust, the high respect he had earned, everything seemed to have crumbled in a matter of moments. Back in his luxurious apartment, Richard felt lonelier than ever. The white walls and expensive furniture seemed to mock him, reminding him of everything he had and at the same time everything he could lose. His phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Sarah, his assistant. "Mr. Anderson, sorry to bother you so late, but the press is in a frenzy. There are rumors about your whereabouts and about an operation involving an illegal casino. The board is demanding an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." Richard sighed, feeling the weight of his real life coming back full force. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be there." Hanging up the phone, he walked to the window, looking at the city sprawled below glittering lights, moving cars, lives being lived. And somewhere out there was Beth, probably struggling to reconcile the John she knew with the Richard he really was. At that moment, Richard made a decision. No matter what happened to his company, his fortune or his reputation, he would do whatever it took to prove to Beth that his feelings were true, that behind the disguise and the lies there was a man who really cared. But as he made this silent promise, Richard couldn't imagine the challenges that awaited him. The revelation of his identity was just the beginning. The real trials, both for his heart and his character, were yet to come. The night advanced, and with it, the promise of a new day. A day that would bring new revelations, new challenges, and perhaps a chance for redemption. But for now, all Richard could do was wait, reflect, and prepare to face the consequences of his actions. On the other side of the city, in the Thompson house, Beth sat in her room, looking at a photo she had secretly taken of John working in the garden. Emotions fought inside her. Anger at the lie, hurt at the betrayal, but also, deeply buried, a persistent feeling of connection that she couldn't completely deny. "Who are you really, Richard Anderson?" she whispered to the photo, a solitary tear running down her cheek. "And what do you really want from me?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Only time could reveal the truth behind the masks and the real intentions of the hearts involved in this complex plot of love, deception, and redemption.